Rector of the University of Iceland, Kristín Ingólfsdóttir, ministers of the Icelandic government, ambassadors and representatives of foreign states, dear colleagues, dear guests, and finally, but prominently, honorary speaker Noam Chomsky. My name is Ástráður Eysteinsson, and as Dean of the School of Humanities, I should like to welcome you to this event, which constitutes a key contribution of our school to the Centennial Celebration of the University of Iceland. Our speaker here today will be talking about points of historical reference and their slipperiness and precariousness to the extent of blindness or erasure. One of the most frequently heard points of historical reference here in Iceland in the past 3 years is after the crash, eftir hrunið. What we faced after the economic crash 3 years ago was for some a kind of ground zero, a shock, but also perhaps a glimpse of hope that we could now build afresh and do things differently. Many felt that we might have learned the importance of critical thinking, gagnrýnin hugsun, as we call it in Icelandic. And people in academia, including us in the humanities, thought that this might lend an edge to the social role of the university. What all of us should have learned is the inevitability of politics, the fact that we are all social beings and therefore political, and that we must not leave politics to professional politicians, nor vital social issues to what has been called a free market. The honorary guest of the School of Humanities on the occasion of the centenary of the University of Iceland has sought to teach us these lessons for some decades now. Time and again he has demonstrated that critical thinking and political enlightenment means scratching through the surface of shallow and often misleading media coverage and the ideological reconstruction, manipulation, or forgetting, willful or not, of events that shape the lives and environments of people in different parts of the world. Noam Chomsky, Professor Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, is a prolific and renowned scholar of linguistics. He has had an enormous impact in that field as well as in adjacent fields. He is often said to be the most cited scientist alive. What is truly astounding is how Professor Chomsky has found time for what can only be called another full-time career as a social critic and activist. He has traveled widely as a lecturer and participant at conferences, and he has written numerous political articles and books. Professor Chomsky gave a fascinating talk on linguistics earlier today, contributing to an interdisciplinary MA course now underway at the University of Iceland, dedicated to the various aspects of his scholarship and career. We now get to listen to his political lecture. 9/11 is only 2 days away, and the title of today's talk is The Two 9/11s, Their Historical Significance. It is a privilege and a great pleasure for us in the School of Humanities to have Professor Noam Chomsky as our honorary guest and lecturer. Welcome, Professor Chomsky.
Thank you. Thank you. In a few days, we'll be commemorating the 10th anniversary of 9/11, the day that changed the world according to general and scholarly discourse, a horrendous crime committed with wickedness and awesome cruelty, in the accurate words of the noted Middle East correspondent Robert Fisk at the time. It's useful to remember that however awful as the crimes were, they could have been a lot worse. Not hard to imagine So suppose, for example, that the attack had gone as far as bombing the White House, killing the president, imposing a brutal military dictatorship that killed thousands of people, tortured tens of thousands, while establishing an international terror center that helped impose similar torture and terror states elsewhere, carried out an international assassination campaign, and as an extra fillip brought in a team of economists, let's call them the Kandahar boys, who drove the economy into one of the worst depressions in U.S. history. That plainly would have been a lot worse than what happened on 9/11/2001. Unfortunately, it's not a thought experiment. It happened. The only inaccuracy in this brief review is that the numbers should be multiplied by 25. So 50 to 100,000 killed, 700,000 tortured, to yield per capita equivalence, which is the appropriate measure. Well, I'm referring, of course, to what in Latin America is often called the first 9/11, September 11th, 1973, when the United States succeeded in its intensive efforts to overthrow the democratic government of Salvador Allende in Chile with a military coup that placed General Pinochet's brutal regime in office. One way to get a sense of the consequences is to visit the Villa Grimaldi in Santiago, one of Pinochet's worst torture chambers, guided by one of the rare survivors who can describe the exquisite torture regime stage by stage, with doctors attending at each stage to ensure that the subject arrives to the next and more horrific stage until almost inevitable death. It's an experience I had a few years ago, and it's not easily forgotten, nor is it easily forgotten that the doctors are practicing in Santiago, just as doctors and psychologists who were supervising torture at Guantanamo are happily practicing in the United States. Nowhere near as horrendous, of course. The goal of the operation that succeeded on 9/11/1973, in the words of the Nixon administration, was, I'm quoting, to kill the virus that might encourage all of those foreigners who are out to screw us by taking over their own resources and pursuing a policy of independent development in other ways. This quotes from recently released tapes. In the background was a thesis expressed by the National Security Council, highest planning body, that if the United States could not control Latin America, it could not expect to achieve a successful order elsewhere in the world, that is, to control the rest of the world, which is a very explicit goal of planners since World War II placed the United States in a position of global dominance with no analog in history. Well, by any reasonable standards, the first 9/11 was far more severe than the second, and its consequences were far more grim. But the first 9/11, unlike the second, is not held to have changed the world. Quite the contrary, it was, I'll quote, "it was nothing of very great significance," Henry Kissinger's words when he assured his boss a few days later after the successful outcome. And it remains almost unknown in the civilized West. Actually, there was a good illustration of that yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, main business journal. There was an article that pondered seriously the strange fact that Afghans don't seem to care much about 9/11. In fact, many of them know little about it and don't seem to care. though, of course, the educated sectors are well aware, especially those who are educated in the West. They have the right story. The authors of the article, their colleagues, their readers, this was attributed to the illiteracy of the Afghan population and their cultural backwardness. Unlike the Afghans, the authors of the article, their colleagues, their readers, are quite literate, and by standard measures, conventional measures, they're culturally advanced. But the idea that we should even think about the first 9/11, for which, of course, we bear substantial responsibility, that idea is so outlandish that even to consider it would be inconceivable or maybe treacherous. It's a fact that yields some lessons about the moral and intellectual culture, not just of the United States, but the West generally. Well, these events of little consequence, borrow Kissinger's words, the events of little consequence on 9/11, 1973, were not limited to the military coup that destroyed Chilean democracy and set in motion the horror story that followed. The first 9/11 was just one act in a drama that took shape in 1962 when President Kennedy shifted the mission of the Latin American military, which of course the U.S. controls, shifted their mission from a hemispheric defense, that was an anachronism from World War II, shifted it from that to internal security, which is no joke. And the consequences are outlined by Charles Maechling. He was the person who led counterinsurgency and internal defense planning from 1961 to 1966, the Kennedy and early Johnson administrations. He described Kennedy's 1962 decision as a shift, I'm quoting him, from toleration of the rapacity and cruelty of the Latin American military to direct complicity in their crimes, to U.S. support for the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads. There's a recently published Cambridge University academic scholarly history of the Cold War. In it, one of the chapters is by Latin American scholar John Coatsworth. He writes that from that time, 1962, to the Soviet collapse in 1990, I'm quoting him, the numbers of political prisoners, torture victims, and executions of nonviolent political dissenters in Latin America vastly exceeded those in the Soviet Union and its East European satellites. That included many religious martyrs. There was a kind of a war against the church underway, and mass slaughter as well, consistently supported or initiated in Washington, equally consistently backed in Europe. The last major violent act was the brutal murder of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, just days after the Berlin Wall fell, also their housekeeper and daughter, to ensure that no witnesses survived. The perpetrators were an elite Salvadoran battalion, which had already left a shocking trail of blood, probably tens of thousands of victims. They had just returned to El Salvador after renewed training at the John F. Kennedy School of Special Warfare in North Carolina. And they were acting on direct orders of the High Command, which had intimate relations with the U.S. government. That was revealed 2 years ago in the Spanish press and the Salvadoran press, arousing no interest in the West. This savage slaughter framed a decade in El Salvador, which opened with the assassination of Archbishop Romero, who was known as the voice for the voiceless, by much the same hands while he was reading Mass. Also a matter of no consequence, little noticed, long forgotten. If anything remotely like this had happened, say, in Czechoslovakia, horror would have been unconstrained. They would have been denounced, crimes would have been denounced eloquently as a vivid illustration of the unspeakable criminality of the Kremlin conspiracy to rule the world. We might have gone on to war. But the events took place in U.S. domains and are therefore of little consequence and quickly forgotten in the West. The masters of mankind borrow Adam Smith's phrase, the people who own the economy and those who serve them, they enjoy a more pleasing self-image. Actually, it's articulated rather well in Britain's leading journal of international affairs. Last few issues, articles discuss, I'm quoting, the visionary international order of the second half of the 20th century, marked by the universalization of an American vision of commercial prosperity, and they muse soberly over whether the rising Asian powers will someday become mature enough to abide by the norms of the international system crafted by the West, namely non-interference, diplomatic interdependence, and the sovereignty and equality of all states. One of the pleasures of intellectual life is that one can reside comfortably in these attractive domains. I should say that not everyone succumbs to these doctrines about Western magnificence. Some interpret the norms of the international order quite differently. For example, very recently, a respected left liberal commentator in the United States, Matthew Iglesias, who writes that one of the main functions of the international institutional order is precisely to legitimate the use of deadly military force by Western powers, where the term Western, of course, means the United States or those it authorizes. Now, these words are not criticism, but applause. We must accept them as not only valid, but laudable. One can raise no more than tactical objections if, say, the United States invades other countries, murders and destroys with abandon, overthrows governments, assassinates suspects at will, as it's doing now, and otherwise fulfills its obligation in the service of the civilized world. If the traditional victims see the matters somewhat differently, that merely reveals that they're like Afghans. They're uncultivated, they have a long way to go to reach our level of enlightenment. Well, let's return to the thought experiment concerning 9/11 and just carry it a few steps further. Suppose that on the 10th anniversary of the first 9/11, the victims had sent a secret mission to the United States to assassinate Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, then dumping their bodies at sea. Would that have elicited exuberant approval in the West? Well, again, the thought experiment is quite real, as we all know. On May 1st, an elite team of U.S. commandos, Navy SEALs, invaded Pakistan on a mission to assassinate Osama bin Laden, who is the presumed, I stress presumed, mastermind of the second 9/11, and they carried out their mission successfully after having apprehended him unarmed and defenseless, accompanied by his wife, who the commandos shot in self-defense when she lunged at them, according to the White House report. We may recall that Nixon and Kissinger are not merely the presumed masterminds of the first 9/11. Their responsibility is not only well documented from impeccable sources, but it's also acknowledged and with pride. A plausible reconstruction of the bin Laden assassination is provided by a veteran Middle East and military correspondent, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, Yoki Drazen, and colleagues in the Atlantic Magazine, mainstream journal. They conclude that the White House apparently did not consider the option of capturing Osama bin Laden alive. They made that clear, I'm virtually quoting, to the clandestine Special Operations Command that carried out the operation. It's verified by a senior U.S. official with knowledge of the discussions, confirmed by other high military officials. The authors add, for many at the Pentagon and Central Intelligence Agency, killing the militant was a necessary and justified act of vengeance. Furthermore, capturing bin Laden alive would have presented the administration with an array of nettlesome legal and political challenges. You can guess what they were. Better than to assassinate him, dumping his body at sea without autopsy. Predictably provoking both anger and quite a lot of skepticism in Pakistan and beyond. Well, the Atlantic inquiry goes on to say that the decision to kill bin Laden outright was the clearest illustration to date of a little-noticed aspect of the Obama administration's counter-terror policy. The Bush administration kidnapped and imprisoned suspects without charge and not very politely, as has been amply documented. Obama, in contrast, like, for example, sending them to Libya for torture, Obama, in contrast, simply eliminates them. The authors quote former West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who told German TV that the U.S. raid was quite clearly a violation of international law and that bin Laden should have been detained and put on trial. And they contrast Schmidt with Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, who defended the decision to kill bin Laden, although he didn't pose an immediate threat to the Navy SEALs. He told a House panel that the assault had been lawful, legitimate, and appropriate in every way. The disposal of the body without autopsy was also criticized by allies. The highly respected British legal authority, Geoffrey Robertson, who incidentally supported the intervention and opposed the execution only on pragmatic grounds, he nevertheless described Obama's claim that justice was done as an absurdity, as should have been obvious to a former professor of constitutional law. He went on to say that both Pakistani and international law mandate an inquiry whenever violent death occurs from government or police action. And he says, I'm quoting, "The United States is therefore under a duty to hold an inquiry that will satisfy the world as to the true circumstances of the killing, exactly how bin Laden came to be shot in the head, especially if it was in the back of his head, execution style, therefore requires explanation," and asks why a hasty burial at sea without a post-mortem, as the law requires. You can again guess the reasons, as much of the world is doing. Robertson usefully reminds us, quote him, "It was not always thus. When the time came to consider the fate of men much more steeped in wickedness than Osama bin Laden, namely the Nazi leadership, the British government wanted them hanged within 6 hours of capture. President Truman demurred. He cited the conclusion of Justice Robert Jackson, chief U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg, his judgment that summary execution would not sit easily on the American conscience and would not be remembered by our children with pride. The only course is to determine the innocence or guilt of the accused after a hearing as dispassionate as the times will permit, and upon a record that will leave our reasons and motives clear." That was 1945. We've traveled a long way from then. In societies that profess some respect for civilized norms, suspects are apprehended and brought to fair trial. And I stress suspects. In June 2002, 8 months after the 9/11 attacks, the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, he spoke to the press, and he presented what the Washington Post described as among his most detailed public comments on the origins of the attack. He could say only that investigators believe that the September 11th attacks came from al-Qaeda leaders in Afghanistan, that the actual plotting was done in Germany, and that the financing came through the United Arab Emirates from sources in Afghanistan. Well, what the FBI believed in June 2002, they plainly didn't know 8 months earlier when the bombing began, in order to compel the Taliban to turn the suspect over to Washington. So it is not true, as President Obama claimed after the assassination, his words, "We quickly learned that the 9/11 attacks were carried out by al-Qaeda." Well, there's never been any reason to doubt what the FBI believed in mid-2002, but that leaves us far from the proof of guilt that's required in civilized societies. And whatever the evidence might be, it doesn't warrant murdering a suspect who could easily have been apprehended. In fact, he was apprehended and brought to trial. And much the same is true of the evidence that's been provided since. The most comprehensive report to date is the government's official 9/11 Commission. It published many volumes. It provided extensive circumstantial evidence of bin Laden's role in 9/11, almost entirely based on what it had been informed about confessions by prisoners in Guantanamo. Nothing direct that they could find. Well, it's unlikely that much of that would have held up in an independent court, considering the shocking way in which confessions were elicited, which you know about, I'm sure. But in any event, the conclusions of an official investigation based on secondhand evidence, however convincing one may find them, they plainly fall far short of a sentence by a credible court, and that's what shifts the category of the accused from suspect to convicted. Well, continuing with thought experiments, which are a useful intellectual device, we might ask ourselves how we would react if Iraqi commandos landed at George W. Bush's compound, assassinated him, and dumped his body in the Atlantic after proper burial, of course. Uncontroversially, he's not merely a suspect. He's rather what he called the decider, his term, who gave the orders to invade Iraq, that is, to commit, quoting, the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. That's quoting the Nuremberg Tribunal, since incorporated in international law. Well, in Iraq, the accumulated evil of the whole includes hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions of refugees, destruction of much of the country and its national heritage, and the murderous sectarian conflict that is now spread to the rest of the region. And uncontroversially, these crimes vastly exceed anything attributed to bin Laden. To say that this is uncontroversial, as it surely is not to imply that it's not denied. There are people who insist that the world is flat. So it doesn't change the fact that it's uncontroversial that the earth is not flat. Similarly, it's uncontroversial that Stalin and Hitler were responsible for horrendous crimes, but of course loyalists deny it. All of this should again be too obvious for comment. It is not, however, and that's a fact from which we again can learn something about our cultural milieu. Similarly, it's uncontroversial that Bush and associates did commit the supreme international crime. the crime of aggression. Now, that crime was defined clearly enough by Justice Jackson, Chief of Counsel for the United States at Nuremberg, later reiterated in an authoritative General Assembly resolution. An aggressor, in Jackson's words, opening statement to the tribunal, an aggressor is the first to commit such actions as invasion of its armed forces, with or without a declaration of war, in the territory of another state. And no one, even the most extreme supporter of the aggression, denies that Bush and associates did exactly that. We might also do well to recall Justice Jackson's eloquent words at Nuremberg on the principle of universality. If certain acts of violation of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them. And we are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others which we would not be willing to have invoked against us. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. So we're left with two choices. Either Bush and associates are guilty of the supreme international crime, includes Blair and others, including all the evil that followed, the crimes that go vastly beyond anything attributed to bin Laden, or else we simply declare that the Nuremberg proceedings were a farce and that the Allies were guilty of judicial murder, victor's justice. I don't think there's an alternative. Again, that's entirely independent of the question of the guilt of those charged, established by the Nuremberg Tribunal. In the case of the Nazi criminals, plausibly surmised, but no more than that, from the outset in the case of bin Laden. And there was an opportunity to prove the case in court, but that was undermined by President Obama. Again, we may ask why. A few days before the bin Laden assassination, a gentleman named Orlando Bosch died peacefully in Florida, where he resided along with his accomplice, Luis Posada Carriles, and many of their associates in international terrorism. In this case, it's the massive program of terror against Cuba that was launched by President Kennedy, continued by his successors, a program which was intended to bring, quoting, to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. That's Kennedy advisor, historian Arthur Schlesinger, in his biography of Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy was assigned this task to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba as his highest priority, and it was pretty serious. Bosch was accused of dozens of terrorist crimes by the FBI and then granted a presidential pardon by Bush #1 over the objections of the Justice Department. Quote them, they found the conclusion inescapable that it would be prejudicial to the public interest of the United States to provide a safe haven for Bosch. The coincidence of deaths, the bin Laden, Bosch, that at once should call to mind the George W. Bush doctrine, which has already become a de facto rule of international relations, according to the noted Harvard international relations specialist Graham Allison. The doctrine revokes the sovereignty of states that provide sanctuary to terrorists, Allison writes. He's referring to Bush's pronouncement to the Taliban that those who harbor terrorists are as guilty as the terrorists themselves. Such states, therefore, have lost their sovereignty and are fit targets for bombing and terror. For example, the state that harbored Bosch and his associates. When Bush issued this new de facto rule of international relations, no one seemed to notice that he was calling for invasion and destruction of the United States and murder of its criminal presidents. None of this is problematic, of course, if we simply reject Justice Jackson's principle of universality and adopt instead the principle that the powerful are self-immunized against international law and conventions, as in fact they make very clear. Washington has made it very clear repeatedly, in fact much too little understood, and in very explicit terms. It's also non-problematic if we simply adopt the liberal intellectual doctrine, quoted again, the international order is designed to legitimate the use of deadly military force by the United States. Finally, it's worth thinking about the name given to the assassination mission, assassination of bin Laden. It was called Operation Geronimo. It's an illustration of how deeply rooted the imperial mentality is. Few seem to be able to perceive that the White House, Obama's White House, was glorifying bin Laden by calling him Geronimo. Geronimo was the Apache Indian chief who led the courageous resistance to the invaders that sought to consign his people to the fate, I'm quoting, the fate of that hapless race of Native Americans, which we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty, among the heinous sins of this nation, for which I believe God will one day bring it to judgment. Those are not my words. They're the words of the great grand strategist, President John Quincy Adams, the intellectual architect of Manifest Destiny, incidentally many years after his own quite considerable contributions to these sins had passed. Well, there were some who did comprehend the significance of the name, among them the remnants of that hapless race who protested vigorously. And the same was true elsewhere, notably in Mexico, where there was great outrage and disbelief at the choice of name. And remember, these are among people who have not forgotten that the heinous sin in this case was carried out in territories stolen from Mexico in a war of aggression. Well, the reactions that I've mentioned would fall under the category of what's often called American exceptionalism, were it not for the fact that the easy suppression of one's own crimes is virtually ubiquitous among the powerful, of course, apart from those who are defeated and conquered and therefore forced to acknowledge reality. Other current illustrations are too numerous to mention. I'll take just one of great current significance, might lead to nuclear war. Consider Obama's terror weapons, drones, and they are terror weapons, of course. Consider those weapons in Pakistan. Suppose that during another thought experiment, suppose that during the 1980s, when the Russians were occupying Afghanistan, they had carried out targeted assassinations in Pakistan aimed at the high U.S. officials who were financing, arming, and training the insurgents, incidentally quite proudly and openly. For example, the CIA station chief in Islamabad, who explained that he loved the noble goal of his mission, which in his words was to kill Soviet soldiers, not to liberate Afghanistan, a matter that it was of no interest. Well, there's no need to imagine the reaction if that had taken place. In fact, we wouldn't be here to talk about it because it would have led to nuclear war. But we must not overlook a crucial distinction. That was them. This is us. It makes all the difference. These remarks are quite misleading in at least one crucial respect. Necessarily the merest sample, and they might give the impression that they're somehow unusual, but they're not. An honest inquiry, I think, will demonstrate quite convincingly that the sample is all too representative, regrettably. And perhaps the most elementary moral principle, which is expressed in some form in every moral code, is some version of Justice Jackson's principle of universality. We must apply to ourselves the same standards as we impose on others, if not more stringent ones. That principle is almost universally accepted in words and accepted in application with regard to others, particularly official enemies, and it's rejected with quite impressive consistency with regard to ourselves. Where still the blatant contradiction is scarcely noticed. In fact, virtually every society has a respected cadre whose task is to efface it. In the modern world, they're called intellectuals. On the Centennial Celebration of a great university, it seems appropriate to suggest that a primary task of a humanistic education should be to cast a piercing light on this tradition and to bring it to an inglorious end. Thanks.
Professor Chomsky, many thanks for this powerful, challenging, and albeit a little chilling talk. This is what we're facing, and I think you're quite right that we need to think about this as part of our education. I'd like to say that Professor Chomsky, there was an interview taken yesterday for Silver Eels. Quite a long interview. I hope it will all be shown this Sunday if you want to listen some more to Professor Chomsky. It was a fascinating interview ranging between Iceland, the United States, Pakistan, China, touching on so many of the vital political and social issues of today. Okay, I'd like to thank you all for coming to listen to Professor Chomsky and to celebrate with us the centenary of the University of Iceland. Again, thanks to our visitor and honorary lecturer.